There were articles about global warming from greenhouse gases going back to 1912, but they were little snapshotty things emerging as the science started to emerge that CO2, carbon dioxide particularly, could last a long time and trap heat and warm the world. In 1956, the New York Times had a really neat science story on global warming. That was the year I was born, 1956, and I read that piece. The kicker in that story, the closing line was, oil and coal are still plentiful and cheap and will be burned as long as there is a financial reason to do so. I first wrote about climate and humans in 1985 in the context of nuclear winter, which emerged during the Cold War as this idea that if we burned enough cities, the atmosphere would fill with particles that reflect sunlight, would cool the planet disastrously. Same models that were producing that result were the ones that were already being studied in relation to climate change, global warming, greenhouse effect. 1988 is when it became a national story, kind of a headline story. But back then it was still just one of a number of science stories, environmental stories. And it had a very familiar template. There's something we're doing that's bad. And it felt like acid rain had been a story that was already in the headlines. The Montreal Protocol had just been negotiated to ban these other compounds that were eroding the protective ozone layer in the atmosphere. And here was this emerging threat. And so the world seemed to settle pretty quickly with a lot of momentum toward this idea of a treaty and an agreed to timetable for cutting emissions. And then it got complicated in the 90s. Once it was being negotiated toward having actual targets and timetables in a global treaty, penalties and that kind of thing, that's when industry got focused on the issue and the politics got more intense. One of the challenges in climate coverage and on the climate issue is that the policy debate gets mixed up too often with the science debate. And that actually, I think, erodes people's understanding of the science if it becomes a political football, and we're seeing that even now. Uncertainty can be used in debates over policy to promote delay or to promote action. Uncertainty is a very real component of the climate problem, but it gets becomes a destructive thing as opposed to something you focus on. Well, what do we know about sea level rise? Or what do we know about the pace at which temperatures will rise? What kinds of policies are most durable in looking at those questions? It's hard to have that actual discussion in today's media environment. For those of us who moved into online journalism thinking, oh wow, now we can finally, you have these links that go to your backing information behind your simple statements, you have the ability to reach wide audiences, and and it turns out that it's actually more and more compartmentalizing us and fragmenting readership. That's an issue I don't think a lot of people anticipated going into this. So I'd been covering climate change 30 years. I'd gone into academia. I was writing my .earth blog for the Times part-time. The blog, I think, succeeded in opening people's minds to the complexity of some of these issues. But what was lacking through that last number of years doing .earth was synthesis. Then ProPublica announced they had a position open to write about climate change in a kind of in a deep dive way that's so rare in the media now. This is a new model. It's a nonprofit investigative journalism shop that's designed to do journalism in the public interest that has moral force. And that was a real lure for me. I've just begun, I've been there almost a year and it feels like I just got in the door. It's a place that's brimming with brilliant journalists who have an unbelievable capacity to work with numbers, to reveal meaning and data, and to get things done, and that's kind of exciting.